ago, through the dark woods of Maine, 1,000 men marched to take Quebec, but in vain. They knew it would not be easy, but no human tongue could tell, for the things that fell upon them would be a living hell. Their journey was so bold that it mustn't go untold. For 3 months they suffered and they died. But when it was all over and the battle had been lost, the only thing that mattered was they tried. Their spirits were high and their numbers were low. They starved and they froze in the swamps and the snow. They knew they might die, but went on just the same, to the walls of Quebec and to history and fame.
It is 11 a.m. Saturday morning, October 4th, 1975. The scene you see is located in the plains of Abraham National Park, just outside the walls of the upper town of Quebec City, Canada. It is a fine fall day, cool, crisp, and sunny. The soldiers are dressed in authentic-appearing 18th century clothing, copied from original garments and engravings. For the most part, wives and mothers have sewn the costumes. They are armed with reproduction flintlock muskets and rifles. Happily, they are firing blank charges of black powder only. This produces satisfying amounts of smoke and noise, but no injuries. This mock battle is the climactic event of the AEQ-75, the acronym for the Arnold Expedition to Quebec Bicentennial Reenactment. With close to 1,000 American and Canadian participants, 15,000 spectators, radio and TV coverage, the theatrically staged assault on Quebec celebrates a heroic American defeat. It fittingly dramatizes the purposes of this pioneer international bicentennial reenactment to inspire Americans by spotlighting the incredible courage and unselfish patriotism of our colonial soldiers, and to celebrate 200 years of friendly American-Canadian relations. The AEQ-75 took place over a 15-day period in the fall of 1975, starting on September 20th and ending on October 5th. The 600 volunteer participants in colonial dress, together with 200 dependents, traveled from Cambridge and Newburyport, Massachusetts, to Pittston, Maine, thence through northwestern Maine and southern Quebec province to the city of Quebec. Adding to the historical authenticity of the AEQ-75 was a companion venture, the Montgomery Expedition. Using troops from the Brigade of the American Revolution, the expedition retraced the route taken in 1775 through northern New York State and Montreal, joining the main force in Quebec City. Recreated Canadian troops, both British and French, awaited the arrival of the Americans in Quebec City. Sponsored by the Arnold Expedition Historical Society of Pittston, Maine, and the Bicentennial Commissions of 7 states, this movable historical pageant was billed as a once-in-a-lifetime adventure. Inspiration for the AEQ-75 was drawn from accounts of the original audacious march through the wilderness, perhaps best dramatized by Kenneth Roberts in his classic novel, Arnold. The originator of the concept of doing a reenactment was Mr. White Nichols, first president of the AEHS. He began talking about it in the 60s and first printed a mention of it in the Society newsletter of July 18, 1970. Serious planning was underway by the fall of 1972. Essential to the authenticity of any reenactment would be the construction of a fleet of bateaux similar to those used on the expedition. By good fortune, one of the charter members of the Society, Mr. Cecil Pierce of West Southport, Maine, is a lobster fisherman and a boat builder by trade. He and Mr. Duluth Wing of Eustis, Maine, had just completed paddling and portaging a canoe from Fort Western to Quebec City. Setting to work by the end of 1972, Cecil had built 2 prototype bateaux of white pine, each 22 feet long and weighing almost 400 pounds.
When finished, these 200 bateaux, pulled up side by side, would extend 1,000 feet along the shore, end to end, and they would extend up the river a mile. There is little agreement among researchers and historians in any area of this important project. Important because without the bateaux, there would have been no march to Quebec. Were they paid for? Yes and no. Were they a proper vehicle for the job at hand in the first place? Some say yes, others no. Of what dimensions were they? There are no records, but Arnold himself gives us a clue when, upon viewing them, expressed the opinion that they were small and ordered an additional 20 built while he waited. Were they badly constructed? Perhaps. Arnold's bateaux were built quickly, and both the later day historians, or a historian, has said that they were built of green pine, and therefore they were weak, and that was the problem because they were green pine. I don't think that's the case. I think the case is the green pine boat should have been all right if they were built with plenty of fastening. They had no fastening. All fastening at revolutionary times was hand forged. There was no machine-made nails until after 1800. So what I'm trying to point out is that if nails were scarce, certainly no one was driving more than was needed. Hardly enough nails were driven in because they were scarce. So I think the lack of fastening, lack of iron, was a reason that bateaux were weak if they were weak. And the journalists damned the bateaux as being sloppily built, not knowing they were not necessarily boat builders. They didn't know what they were talking about, except they knew they were coming apart on them. And I think it's because of the lack of nails.
By September 1974, the Society owned 6 bateaux. The Bath Marine Museum's apprentice shop was building them. 13 were needed for the great bateau race on Natanas Pond, and at $400 apiece, this was a costly problem. By the fall of 1975, however, every company had its own bateaux. Officers and men had been recruited and uniformed. Countless meetings had been held from Maine to Pennsylvania. Recon trips over the main portion of the route and visits to Quebec City were made. National Guard trucks and Civil Defense field kitchens were ready to go. Suddenly, it was Saturday the 20th of September, and the troops were lining up for the parade and review on Cambridge Common. This colorful event was enhanced by Captain David Holmes' macabre company, Authentic Tent Camp. The men lived and slept in these canvas shelters throughout the expedition. Mr. Tom Nolan of Arden, New York, organized the Montgomery expedition, playing the part of General Richard Montgomery. Here he doubles as General George Washington, ordering Colonel Benedict Arnold and his men to attack Quebec. He wears a handsome buff and blue uniform and a white wig. Resplendent in a bright red uniform coat and white plumed tricorn is Colonel Thornton B. McGlamory of Mount Vernon, Maine, playing the role of Arnold. Dr. George B. Dyer helped immensely in the early planning and organization of the reenactment. As a divisional commander, he plays the role of Captain Daniel Morgan of Virginia, wearing a typical rifleman's brown fringed hunting shirt. The other 2 divisional commanders were Colonel Anthony Walker, United States Marine Corps retired, of Middletown, Rhode Island, in the role of Lieutenant Colonel Christopher Green, wearing a white hunting shirt, and Mr. Crosby Milliman of Eaton Center, New Hampshire, as Major Returned Jonathan Meigs in brown with a handsome brass gorget. Mr. Robert A. Cunningham of Lincoln, Massachusetts, held down 2 jobs during the AEQ, Vice President of the Historical Society and Deputy Director of the Reenactment. His role was as Major Timothy Bigelow. Here he wears a blue velvet gentleman's outfit, but with the red sash of authority. The Cambridge appearance went off quite successfully with a reasonably good audience. For good measure, the Cambridge authorities threw in a Conestoga wagon and a team that had popped up from somewhere. The troops were hosted in the afternoon and evening by the towns of Byfield, Rowley, Ipswich, Newbury, and Newburyport. Parades were held, and the first of many baked bean and frankfurter suppers was enjoyed. Bert Colwell, in his Newburyport Marine Militia hat, was the local coordinator. John DeLude of Bedford, New Hampshire, marching with his handsome Irish setter, played the part of Captain Henry Dearborn with panache. In the morning, a colonial church service was held at the Old South Church in Newburyport. Afterwards, a parade to the dock on the Merrimack River. Mayor Byron Matthews marched with us, suitably clad in a buff and blue Continental uniform. Jason Correll of Concord, Massachusetts, playing Captain Eleazar Oswald, was information officer for the AEQ. Here he is sheathing his sword after a salute. Mr. Roger F. Duncan of East Boothbay Harbor, Maine, volunteered as Commodore of the AEQ fleet. He was successful in rounding up 13 sloops and schooners for the trip down to the Kennebec River. The Coast Guard had decided that the troops should be ferried to their craft by power boats for safety reasons. This accounts for the somewhat unauthentic appearance of these harbor scenes. 50 men embarked. Ben Soule of the Hanchett Company appeared to be most heavily laden. Crosby Milliman made the most dramatic departure. After a choppy voyage, the vessels arrived safely at Morse's Cove, Phippsburg, about midday on Monday. This is about 7 miles up the Kennebec River from the mouth. Local residents had set up large Army tents and obtained use of a civil defense mobile kitchen. On Tuesday night, a lobster bake was held to top off the visit. Unfortunately, it began raining and rained for the next week. That much authenticity no one needed. The fleet sailed upriver to Bath on Wednesday, where a very soggy parade was held. After lunch, all sailed up to the Colburn House in Pittston, just below Augusta. There, the waterborne troops disembarked, set up camp, and awaited the arrival of the main force for registration on Friday. Friday was still rainy and pretty chaotic, with the hordes of participants and dependents inundating the Colburn House complex. By late afternoon, the divisions had moved out to Gardner, Richmond, and Pittston. Saturday morning, the 27th, the entire AEQ moved to Port Western in Augusta, Maine. Thornton made an informal speech to his troops, and the mayor welcomed the force. Bateau demonstrations were given. A retreat ceremony and review was held at Capitol Park in the late afternoon. In the evening, colonial balls were held in Augusta and Waterville. Sunday, Morgan's men visited Norridgewock. Green's division moved to Waterville, where a mock battle was staged. Meigs' division went to Skowhegan, and put on a well-photographed bateau show in the bend of the Kennebec below the falls. Monday it was Bingham, Kingsfield, and Madison. Tuesday, September 30th, found the men of the AEQ trudging across 7 miles of the 12-mile carry. This is where Arnold's men left the Kennebec and carried to the Dead River. The country is not much different from what it was in 1775. Isolated, remote, wild, and undeveloped, ablaze with fall foliage, marching on a gravel road, this was the real thing. A ceremony was held on the shore of Flagstaff Lake, dedicating a bronze plaque to Arnold's men. Across the lake loomed the massive peaks of Mount Bigelow. Along the shore lay the bleached stumps of virgin forest white pines, 5 and 6 feet across. If they could only talk, what stories they could tell. That night, the whole force camped at Cathedral Pines Campground in Stratton. A council of war was held around a campfire with some minor grievances aired and settled.
Yankee Doodle went to town riding on a pony, stuck a feather in his hat and called it macaroni. Yankee Doodle, keep it up, Yankee Doodle dandy. Fine to the Kansas Devlin with the girls be handy.
The great bateau race was held on Natanis Pond Wednesday morning. This unusual event had been anticipated with great delight and rivalry by each company. John DeLude's New Hampshire company was the winner. Their crew had developed an unusual rowing technique using 2 men to an oar, one pulling and one pushing. It was so effective they won by half a mile. Piling into the National Guard trucks, the AEQ moved out to the border station at Coburn Gore. A long column of military vehicles, followed by the campers and trailers of the dependents, was an impressive sight. Customs clearance was a breeze, reflecting all of the preparation beforehand. And over on the Canadian side awaited a veritable regiment of reception forces. Television crews, reporters, helicopters, Canadian Army escort vehicles, provincial police cars, and police on motorcycles. Moving out behind the sirens of our police escorts, we headed for the welcoming reception at Lac Megantic. Here, our planning officer, Joe Brown, and our bilingual staff aide, John Seitz, began to earn their pay. Lac Megantic, Saint-Marie-du-Beauce, and Saint-Georges were generous and gracious hosts for the night. On Thursday, troops were convoyed in National Guard trucks to Quebec City. Meigs' division decided to march across the bridge over the St. Lawrence River. Others went directly to the Manège Militaire, which is a large armory building that served as quarters for the AEQ-75 in Quebec City. Once settled, enlisted troops were free to explore the city until Saturday morning. And explore they did. All over Quebec could be seen AEQers in their colorful colonial dress, so appropriate in such a beautiful old city. Strains of Eric White's newly composed ballad drifted out from the macabre company tents, pitched in front of the Manège.
Their boat was running low 200 miles to go, but it didn't seem to change their minds at all. For Arnold had the will and the courage to instill a dream to see that city fall. Their spirits were high and their numbers were low. They starved and they froze in the swamps and the snow. They knew they might die, but went on just the same to the walls of Quebec and to history and fame.
Saturday dawned a beautiful day. Everyone was up early. It is pretty difficult to sleep late on a gym floor with the lights on and 500 people walking and talking all around you. Outside, dozens of brightly uniformed different groups milled about on the sidewalks of the square. La Compagnie Franche de la Marine troops were distinctive in their red knitted caps, joining the 78th Fraser Highlanders and many other British units in the defense of the city. Mr. Victor Southron of Ottawa played Colonel Alan McLean, commanding the Canadian forces. After a prayer led by the Reverend James Knorr of Rhode Island, playing the part of Chaplain Samuel Spring, the American attack force left for the west end of the Plains of Abraham.
Like I said, I want to shake all the hands here before we get through, if they'll give me that honor.
The British formed up and left for their defensive positions on the high ground a little later. Promptly at 11 a.m., the battle started. It went very well, with much musket fire and several cannon in action. The spectators were safely off on the left side, leaving plenty of room for maneuvers. After an hour of vigorous attack and counterattack, the preordained surrender of Morgan's men occurred. George Dyer surrendered his sword very dramatically to l'Abbé Provost of the Quebec Seminary. The battle was over. The troops returned to the manege and their civil defense cook trucks for lunch. At 2 p.m., a colorful parade through the upper and lower towns was held. Fife and drum, waving flags, cheering spectators, marching through the narrow streets of this ancient city was unforgettable. Final event of the Bicentennial reenactment was the wind-up banquet. Held in a large government building cafeteria across the street from the manege, it took a long time to get fed. Speeches, recognition of local dignitaries, and awards to the organizers ended the evening and the AEQ-75. Next morning at 8 a.m., the National Guard trucks convoyed the force back home to the Colburn House in Pittston, Maine. It was all over. We had pulled it off. It had truly been a once-in-a-lifetime adventure. Perhaps the most eloquent valedictory comment was made by 12-year-old drummer boy Scott Armstrong of Harleysville, Pennsylvania, who after returning home told his mother that there could not possibly be anything more for him in life. It had peaked out.
I had such a great time. I don't think anything will ever be as much fun.
The goals of the bicentennial celebrations held in the United States in 1976 had been twofold. First, to commemorate our beginning as a country, and secondly, to bring people together. We had succeeded in accomplishing both. We had celebrated a military defeat, but a victory of the spirit, and had rekindled some of our forebears' zeal in the selfless cooperative effort to make the AEQ-75 a success. We had pulled together people from all over the United States, not to mention Canada. They worked hard but had fun and became great friends. That was the greatest benefit of friendships formed. We have the same feeling of camaraderie that athletic teams or cast members of a theatrical show develop. We are all veterans of a unique experience which we shall never forget. This video is produced in the fall of 1990 to mark the 15th anniversary of the march. It is dedicated to the memory of those who made it possible but now are gone. Dr. George B. Dyer of New Hope, Pennsylvania, commander of Morgan's division on the march, was a graduate of Yale and a professional educator historian. An enthusiastic, gracious, hospitable man, George died at the age of 75 on November 9, 1978. Mr. R. White Nichols, concept originator, lived in Wiscasset, Maine. He was a dedicated environmentalist before it became a popular thing to do. White played a part in helping the state reclaim 400,000 acres of lost public lots from the paper companies, and almost single-handed was successful in preserving the Arnold Trail corridor through northwestern Maine. Mr. Nichols passed away on August 11, 1989, at the age of 85. Colonel Thornton B. McGlamory was selected as director of the AEQ-75 on June 9, 1973. His experience as a colonel in the United States Army Armored Forces and as advisor to the Maine National Guard was invaluable. The success of the reenactment was chiefly due to Thornton's thorough, careful planning, his hard work, and his charismatic leadership. He was stricken with cancer of the liver in 1986, and after a 4-year hiatus succumbed on February 27, 1990, at the age of 70.
They started in the fall, and their plan could win it all. To take Quebec would mean sure victory. So they put up with the rain, and they suffered through the pain, and they toughed it out together all the way. Their food was running low with 200 miles to go, but it didn't seem to change their minds at all. For Arnold had the will and the courage to instill a dream to see that city fall. Their spirits were high and their numbers were low. They starved and they froze in the swamps and the snow. They knew they might die, but went on just the same to the walls of Quebec and to history and fame. December 31st was the night they had chose. Their numbers were few and their hands and feet were froze, but they fought up to the wall with their hopes to take it all, and to a man at night they all did try. But the British held the wall and they nearly killed them all. Their blood ran crimson in the snow. So they gathered up their wounded and headed south again, with nowhere else but home to go. Their spirits were high and their numbers were low. They starved and they froze in the swamps and the snow. They knew they might die, but went on just the same to the walls of Quebec and to history and fame. To the walls of Quebec and to history and fame.